Please comment, like, and subscribe to Paskvan Podcasts. It really helps the channel.
So, shadow people, huh? When you sent in all this material, I gotta say, I was intrigued. I mean, everyone's heard the stories, right? Those shadowy figures lurking in the corner of your eye. Classic horror movie stuff. But today, we're going deeper.
Deeper than just scary stories, we're diving into the heart of the shadow people phenomenon.
Exactly. We've got a whole pile of historical accounts, modern sightings, you name it, psychological studies, even some paranormal theories that are, well, a little out there.
Out there is right, but that's what we're here for. By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a much clearer picture of what we're dealing with.
All right, then. Let's get into it. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, the human fascination with shadows goes way back, like ancient civilizations way back. So I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, take us back in time then. What kind of ancient tales are we talking about?
Well, it's fascinating, actually. Across cultures, shadows are often linked to the soul, the afterlife, the other side.
Pooky. Right. Like in ancient Egypt, they believed in the Ka. It was a spiritual double, kind of like a person's shadow that stayed with them throughout life and even into the afterlife.
A shadow self, eternally linked.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if those ancient Egyptians were onto something, right? Like this idea that we all have a hidden part of ourselves, maybe even a darker side.
That's a great point. And you see similar ideas in other ancient cultures, too. The Greeks and Romans, they had the concept of the shade, this shadowy figure associated with the soul's journey to the underworld. They weren't always seen as evil, more like omens or warnings.
So we've got shadows representing the soul, the afterlife, something beyond our world.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. Native American tribes have legends of shadow figures, too. Sometimes they're protectors, other times they're more like spiritual guides, harbingers of change. And in Asian cultures, they're often tied to ancestor spirits, those who have passed on.
So no matter where you look, people have always looked at shadows and seen something, well, profound, something connected to life and death. But let's get out of the history books for a minute and talk about what people are actually reporting seeing these days. What are some of the common characteristics of these shadow people?
Well, despite all those cultural differences, there are some pretty striking similarities. People consistently describe them as humanoid, but lacking any real features. And of course, they're darker than their surroundings, which is what makes them so unsettling.
Yeah, it's a lack of detail, right? Like where a face should be, there's just nothing. Makes them seem less than human.
Right. And their movement is often described as super quick and erratic, almost like they're not bound by the same physical laws as us. They just appear and vanish, which adds to the whole mystery and the fear factor.
Like catching a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, and then poof, it's gone.
Exactly. And then there's the feeling that many people describe, like a sense of dread being watched or like a sudden coldness in the air.
That feeling of being watched. Stuff of nightmares. But it gets even creepier. Some reports even mention sounds or voices associated with these shadow figures. So we've set the stage here, all the spooky vibes. But now, let's get into some of the explanations, right? And I'll talk about the really out there stuff, the paranormal theories. What are we dealing with here? Trapped spirits, interdimensional beings? Are we talking time travelers?
All right, let's break it down. One of the most popular theories is the trapped spirits idea. Basically, it suggests that shadow people are the spirits of those who've died but are stuck between this world and whatever comes next.
Okay, so not necessarily evil, just lost.
Yeah, that's the gist. Then you've got the interdimensional beings theory. This one gets into the whole parallel universe thing. The idea is that maybe shadow people are beings from other dimensions just kind of accidentally crossing over into our reality.
A glitch in the matrix, huh?
Something like that. And then there's the demonic theory, which is a bit more intense. This one says that shadow people are basically evil, negative energy. You see this a lot in cases where people feel threatened during the encounter.
Okay, that one's a little too creepy for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you can't ignore it, right? What else is out there?
Well, we've also got the time traveler theory. It suggests that maybe shadow people are just visitors from the future and their blurry, shadowy appearance is some side effect of their time travel technology.
It's getting pretty out there, even for me. Fun to think about, but not a lot to back it up, right?
Right. And then there's the idea that maybe they're not entities at all, but just imprints of past events, particularly traumatic ones, like an echo replaying over and over.
So like a ghostly recording etched into a location.
Exactly.
Wow, we've got theories all over the place here, from lost souls to time travelers. But before we get too carried away with all the spooky stuff, let's try and ground ourselves a bit, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the psychological or scientific explanations for these sightings?
Well, it's important to remember that these explanations don't necessarily negate anyone's experience, but they do offer some alternative ways of understanding what might be happening. One of the most relevant is sleep paralysis.
Ah, sleep paralysis,
Yeah.
where you're conscious but can't move. Isn't that often associated with hallucinations? Especially those shadow figures looming over the bed.
Exactly. The fear that comes with sleep paralysis can really amplify those hallucinations, make them feel incredibly real. And then you've got something called pareidolia. It's basically our brain's tendency to see patterns, even in random things. Like that coat rack in the corner suddenly looks like a menacing figure.
So our brains are kind of hardwired to make connections, even if they're not really there.
Right. And then there are hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. That hazy time just as you're falling asleep or waking up.
That in-between zone where you're not quite sure what's real or a dream.
Exactly. Those states are prime time for hallucinations, and a lot of shadow people reports happen during those times. And then, of course, we have to consider things like neurological conditions. Some types of migraines, epilepsy, even schizophrenia can cause visual hallucinations.
So it's important to consider all the possible medical factors before jumping to conclusions about the paranormal.
Absolutely. And there are also environmental factors that can play a role, things like flickering lights or even infrasound.
Infrasound, that's what, like those low-frequency sounds we can't even hear. I've heard those can cause some pretty weird feelings.
Yeah, it messes with our senses without us even realizing it, can cause anxiety, even visual distortions. And don't forget good old-fashioned stress and fatigue. When we're sleep deprived or stressed out, we're way more susceptible to all sorts of perceptual errors.
So our minds and bodies can play some pretty crazy tricks on us. Fascinating stuff. We've covered a lot of ground here already. The history, the characteristics, and now some of the possible explanations, both paranormal and scientific. But coming up in part 2, I want to bring this into the 21st century and talk about the impact of technology, especially the internet, on this whole shadow people phenomenon.
Oh yeah, the internet has changed the game. How we share these experiences, how we connect with others, even how we investigate them. It's a whole new chapter in the mystery.
Welcome back to our deep dive on shadow people.
All right, so last time we went from ancient myths to modern sightings, explored everything from demonic entities to good old sleep paralysis. But now I'm curious, how has technology, and specifically the internet, impacted our understanding of this whole shadow people thing?
Well, it's been a bit of a double-edged sword, to be honest. On one hand, it's created this huge network for people to share their experiences, right? You've got online forums, people making YouTube videos of their ghost hunts, even those whole paranormal TV shows. A topic that was once kind of taboo is now, well, everywhere. Yeah, and I mean, a quick Google search and you'll find tons of personal accounts, photos, videos claiming to show shadow people. It's like a never-ending stream of spooky content.
And that's part of the problem, right? With all that information floating around, it's hard to know what's genuine and what's a hoax or just a misinterpretation. The internet can be a breeding ground for misinformation. It's easy to get caught up in all the sensationalized stories and forget to use a little critical thinking.
So technology can be a tool to document these experiences, but it can also blur the lines between fact and fiction. Makes sense. But what about the technology used in those paranormal investigations? Like, do infrared cameras, EMF detectors, all those gadgets really prove anything?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer. Some people say yes, it gives us objective evidence, while others think it just adds another layer of complexity to something that's already pretty subjective. But let's look at some of those tools, right? Infrared cameras, for example, can pick up on those subtle temperature changes that we can't see with the naked eye. They detect heat signatures.
So the theory is, if a shadow person is some kind of energy or presence, it might show up as a cold spot on the camera.
Exactly. Of course, there are also totally normal explanations for cold spots, like drafts or just variations in the building materials. But when you combine it with other evidence, it can be pretty intriguing.
And then there are those EMF detectors. I see those all the time on those ghost hunting shows. What are they actually measuring?
EMF stands for electromagnetic field, and basically these detectors measure fluctuations in that field. The idea is that paranormal entities, like shadow people, might disrupt the electromagnetic field, causing these spikes or dips that the detector picks up. But here's the thing. EMF detectors can also be triggered by everyday electronics, the wiring in the walls, all sorts of mundane things. So you gotta rule all that stuff out before you jump to any conclusions about ghosts.
It's all about eliminating the explainable, right? Okay, so what about those EVP recordings? Those ghostly whispers and disembodied voices, those always creep me out.
EVPs, short for electronic voice phenomena. They're basically audio recordings, often made in supposedly haunted locations, where the theory is that spirits can kind of manipulate electronics to communicate. And yeah, I get it, those recordings can be super creepy, especially with headphones on. But again, you always have to consider other possibilities. Things like radio frequencies, background noise, even just the investigator themselves subconsciously whispering. It's like those optical illusions, well, you see what you want to see, or in this case, hear what you want to hear.
So even with all this fancy tech, there's still a lot of interpretation involved. It's not like these devices are giving us concrete answers. Sometimes I think the most powerful evidence isn't from a machine at all. It's a person's own experience, their story.
Absolutely. Personal accounts, while they are subjective, are a huge part of paranormal research. They offer insights into the emotional and psychological impact of these encounters, something that a machine can't really capture.
And that's what makes this whole shadow people thing so fascinating, right? I mean, we can talk about theories and scientific explanations all day, but a good personal account, a story well told, can really get under your skin. And it reminds us that there's a human element at the heart of this mystery.
It's really important to treat these personal accounts with respect and sensitivity. I mean, for some people, these experiences can be deeply personal, even traumatic. It's not about exploiting that.
Right? No need to sensationalize it or anything. It's about listening and trying to understand their perspective. Now, before we get to some of those specific cases and research, I think it's a good time to talk about the ethics of investigating something like this. There's a difference between genuine curiosity and just, I don't know, reckless ghost hunting. What are some of the things people should keep in mind if they want to approach this responsibly?
Well, first and foremost, always get permission before investigating any location, right? That includes private homes, cemeteries, historic sites, whatever. Don't trespass or disrespect the people who live or work there.
Right. It's about treating these places with respect, not just barging in for a thrill.
Exactly. And be mindful of other people's beliefs, even if they're different from your own. Don't ridicule someone just because they had an experience that you haven't.
It's about being open-minded, right? Even when we're dealing with something as strange as shadow people. What else?
Don't sensationalize or exaggerate your findings, okay? Stick to the facts, present the evidence clearly, and be upfront about your methods.
Don't try to make a spooky story out of nothing. Let the evidence, or lack thereof, speak for itself.
Right. And lastly, safety first. Don't investigate alone. Be aware of your surroundings, and don't do anything dangerous.
Always good advice, no matter what you're doing. Okay, so we've talked about the ethics of investigating shadow people, but I want to shift gears a bit and talk about coping with these encounters because they can be really unsettling. Even if you try to understand them rationally, the experience itself can be scary. What advice would you give to someone who's had a frightening encounter with a shadow person and is struggling to process it?
First of all, don't dismiss your own feelings. Acknowledge what you experienced. Don't try to convince yourself it was all in your head, because that can lead to feeling isolated and ashamed.
Yeah, it's like you're gaslighting yourself. Remember, you're not alone. There are online groups, support groups, where you can connect with people who have had similar experiences. Sharing your story can be really therapeutic.
It's about finding a community that gets it. And if the fear and anxiety are too much, don't hesitate to reach out to a professional. A therapist who specializes in paranormal experiences can provide guidance and coping mechanisms.
That's a good point. Okay, but what about in the moment? Like if you're feeling that panic or fear right after an encounter, what are some things you can do to calm down?
Well, things like deep breathing or meditation can really help. It's about regulating your nervous system, calming your mind, and bringing yourself back to the present moment.
Taking your mind off the scary stuff and focusing on what's real and right in front of you.
Right. And if it's something you're open to, certain spiritual practices like prayer or visualization can also bring comfort and a sense of protection.
Whatever makes you feel safe and grounded, right. But we also have to consider that some of these encounters might have a medical or environmental explanation.
Absolutely. Sleep paralysis, some neurological conditions, even that infrasound we talked about, can cause hallucinations or perceptual distortions that could easily be mistaken for shadow people. So if the encounters are happening a lot or they're really disturbing, it's always a good idea to talk to a doctor.
Just ruling out any underlying medical causes can bring a lot of peace of mind. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to remind our listeners that everyone copes with these experiences in their own way. There's no right or wrong answer.
It's about finding what works for you, whether that's talking to someone, exploring your spirituality, seeking medical advice, or whatever else helps.
The most important thing is to approach these experiences with curiosity and respect, and of course, a healthy dose of critical thinking.
And remember, even when things seem scary or confusing, you have the power to understand and navigate your own experiences.
Love that. All right, coming up in part 3, we're going to explore some of the most haunted locations associated with shadow people and really try to tackle that big question. What are these entities? Are we talking about interdimensional beings, manifestations of our deepest fears, or something else entirely? Stick with us as we continue to unravel this shadow people mystery.
The adventure continues.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our shadow people deep dive.
We've gone through the history, the psychology, all those paranormal theories.
We even talked about the tools and techniques people use to investigate these things.
And now it's time for the truly spooky stuff.
The haunted locations.
Right. We've talked about how some places have so many shadow people sightings that it's practically part of the local folklore.
I'm ready for a virtual ghost tour then. Where are we headed first?
How about Waverly Hills Sanatorium? It's in Kentucky.
Waverly Hills.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that place.
It's an abandoned tuberculosis hospital.
With a pretty tragic past, right? I know it's considered one of the most haunted spots in the U.S.
Yeah, thousands of patients died there.
I always get chills thinking about places like that.
Yeah.
So what kind of shadow people activity have people reported at Waverly Hills?
Well, visitors and investigators have seen all sorts of things. Dark figures lurking in the hallways,
Oh, no, thank you.
peering out from empty rooms. Some even say they've seen them darting across what they call the death tunnel.
The Death Tunnel.
Yeah, it's where they used to transport the bodies of the patients who died.
Ugh, that's just too creepy. It makes you wonder, right? If
Yeah.
all that suffering and death somehow imprinted itself on the place.
Yeah, it's a common idea in paranormal circles that those kinds of intense emotions can linger.
And maybe even attract these shadow figures.
Exactly.
All right, so Waverly Hills is definitely a no-go for me. What other haunted hotspots are we visiting today?
Let's hop across the Atlantic to Edinburgh, Scotland,
Okay.
to Edinburgh Castle.
Ooh, a cat.
It's this ancient fortress that's seen centuries of battles, sieges, executions, you name it.
So it's probably got its fair share of restless spirits.
You could say that. Including, of course, shadow people.
A castle full of ghosts and shadows. That sounds like something straight out of a movie.
Right. People have reported seeing shadow figures all over the castle.
Like where?
In the dungeons,
Makes sense.
the ramparts, even the royal
Oh,
apartments.
place is safe.
And there's this one particularly chilling story
Okay, I'm listening.
about the shadow of a headless drummer boy.
A headless drummer boy. That's terrifying.
And they say he appears right before some kind of national disaster.
Wow, that's both fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah.
It's like these shadow figures are tapping into our deepest fears, you know?
Yeah, I get that feeling too.
All right, so we've been to a haunted hospital, a spooky castle.
Hmm.
What's our final stop on this haunted tour?
Let's head back to the United States, to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia.
Eastern State Penitentiary. Okay, another place with a dark history, right?
It was a prison, once considered a model of reform, but known for its harsh conditions and solitary confinement.
Yeah, not exactly a happy place. So what makes it a hotspot for shadow people?
Well, it's a popular tourist attraction now.
A lot of those old prisons are.
People go for the history, and some go for the paranormal activity.
So lots of shadow people sightings.
Definitely. People report seeing them in the cell blocks, the corridors, even the guard towers.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've talked about hospitals, a castle, and now a prison. All places where people experience suffering or confinement.
Yeah, what do you think that means?
I don't know, but there's got to be a connection, right? Maybe those intense emotions, that energy, is what attracts shadow people.
It's a question researchers and investigators have been asking for years.
Yeah, but even with all these stories and sightings, we still don't know for sure what's really going on. Are these places truly haunted? Do shadow people even exist?
It's a mystery.
And that brings us to the ultimate question. What are shadow people, really?
Right. We've looked at the history, the psychology, the paranormal theories.
Talked about how people investigate these things and even shared some spooky stories from haunted locations.
But the truth is, their true nature remains a mystery.
So, are they just illusions, like tricks of the light and shadows?
Or are they hallucinations, brought on by stress or lack of sleep?
Or maybe something more? Could they be beings from other dimensions, passing through our reality?
Or spirits of the dead unable to find peace?
Some people believe they're manifestations of our own subconscious, our fears and anxieties projected onto the darkness.
Others see them as something darker, malevolent beings.
Harbingers of doom, even demonic forces.
And then there are those who see them as spiritual guides or protectors.
Going back to those ancient beliefs that connect shadows to the soul and the afterlife.
But the truth is, we just don't know.
And maybe that's okay, right? It's that mystery that keeps us curious.
It makes us question what we believe, what we think is real.
And it reminds us that there's still so much out there that we don't understand. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of shadow people, I want to encourage everyone listening. Keep an open mind, be respectful of others' beliefs, and never stop asking questions.
Because the search for answers is just as important as the answers themselves.
And who knows? Maybe one day the shadows will reveal their secret.
Until then, sleep well, everyone.
And may your nights be free of any unwanted shadowy visitors.
Please comment, like, and subscribe to Pask Fan Podcasts. It really helps the channel.